Have you ever imagined falling in love with someone who seems out of this world? A love so mysterious that it blends faith, miracles, and destiny to the point where you don't know if you're dealing with a real woman or an angel sent to save your life? This isn't just another cowboy story. It's a tale that defies logic and reason and will keep you captivated until the very last second. So subscribe to the channel now, because here you'll always receive moving and inspiring stories. And tell me in the comments which city or country you're watching from. I really want to know where these stories are going. Get ready, because what you're about to hear today could change the way you believe in love and destiny. A cowboy marked by pain, a woman shrouded in mystery, and a secret that spans generations, capable of transforming their lives forever. Do you believe in miracles hidden in the dust of dirt roads? If you do, or if you doubt, this story will move you. So subscribe to the channel now, because here you'll always receive moving and inspiring stories that touch the soul. And tell me in the comments which city or country you're watching from. Your participation helps spread these stories even further. Get ready, because what you're about to hear today is something that could have happened to anyone, but it happened to him. A cowboy who believed life had already taken everything from him. It was the early 1980s, when rural nights were still marked by the sound of cicadas and the headlights of pickup trucks illuminating the empty roads. Jonathan Miller, a tall, broad-shouldered, 32-year-old man with a thin beard, was driving home in his old red Chevrolet after another hard day's work on the ranch. The radio was playing a Johnny Cash country song, and his thoughts wandered far and wide, trying to make sense of the days that seemed to repeat themselves endlessly. Suddenly, on a narrow curve, the tires skidded on the rain-soaked road. Sound of metal on metal echoed as the truck lost control, spun twice, and plummeted down the embankment. In the silence that followed, only the sound of the engine stalling and Jonathan's labored breathing could be heard. He tried to open the door, but he was trapped between the wreckage. Blood ran down his forehead, his vision blurred. It was in that moment, between life and death, that he did something he hadn't done in years. He whispered a prayer. "Lord, if there's still any purpose for me, don't let me die here alone." The words had barely left his lips when he felt a gentle hand touch his shoulder. He opened his eyes with difficulty and saw a serene-looking woman, dressed in white, leaning over him. Her voice was calm but firm. "It's going to be okay. I'm here." Jonathan blinked several times, unsure if it was real or the result of the beating. But the feeling was so intense, so comforting, that he believed it. Hours later, back in the hospital, Jonathan woke up in a room lit only by the dim light of a lamp in the corner. Beside him, the same woman sat, holding his hand devotedly. "You're lucky to be alive," she said with a soft smile. "Life isn't over for you yet." He tried to ask who she was, but his voice wouldn't come. He simply closed his eyes again, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. In the days that followed, Jonathan noticed that the nurse's presence was constant. She helped him sit up, brought him water, adjusted his pillows, and always had words of hope. She never wore a name tag, but her gestures were so confident and firm that he believed she was someone experienced. Little by little, with each visit, he began to feel different. Not just healed physically, but touched in soul. One night, when the hospital seemed asleep, Jonathan opened his eyes and saw her standing by the window, gazing at the moon. The silvery light outlined her delicate features, giving the impression that she was not of this world. He wanted to call out to her, but something held him back, as if he were faced with a secret that could not yet be revealed. So he closed his eyes, promising himself that the next day he would ask her name. But the next day brought only silence. When he woke, there was no sign of her. Jonathan called a nurse to ask about the woman who accompanied him at night, but received a confused "Look, Mr. Miller, no one was here besides the regular staff." "Maybe it was the medication," she said, before rushing out. Jonathan was speechless, his heart pounding. How could he explain something that felt so real? He could still feel the warmth of that hand, the soft tone of her voice, the certainty that it hadn't been an illusion. "I saw her. I felt her," he murmured to himself. But everyone seemed convinced he was delusional. In that moment, he understood that he carried a secret that would change his life forever. And that secret began with a question impossible to ignore. Who was that woman? That night, alone in his hospital room, Jonathan picked up the portable radio left by a friend, turned the knob until he found a station, and an old song began to play. He closed his eyes and realized something was about to happen. Something bigger than he could have imagined. Because miracles don't knock on the door with advance warning. They simply arrive. And when they arrive, they leave marks that never fade. The following days seemed to drag on. Jonathan could now walk the hospital corridors, leaning on a makeshift wooden cane. But his mind was fixed on the mysterious figure of the woman who had disappeared. Every time he passed the nurses, he searched their faces for some similarity, some clue that would confirm he hadn't gone mad. Yet no one matched that image of serene eyes and steady hands he remembered so clearly. It was as if he dreamed it, but within him was an unshakable conviction. She existed, determined to find answers. Jonathan began talking to patients and doctors, discreetly asking about a nurse who often passed through the wards at night. The reactions were always the same: awkward smiles, expressions of doubt, and even a hint of discomfort. "We don't have a nurse matching that description here, Mr. Miller," they repeated. Frustration grew, but along with it came something unexpected, a sense of purpose, as if this search were part of something larger that was not yet clear. Back then, there were no cell phones to record faces or audio. Information circulated via the landline in the hallway and through whispered conversations in the bedrooms. Jonathan called his sister Sarah to tell her what he had experienced. "Maybe it was an angel," she said on the other end, her voice low, almost reverent. "God sends help in ways we don't understand." He hung up thoughtfully, the phone's hiss echoing in his mind as a signal that he shouldn't ignore this possibility. The next morning, Jonathan asked to take a walk in the hospital courtyard. The fresh air was on his face, and he could smell the damp scent of freshly cut grass. As he walked slowly, something caught his eye. A white handkerchief folded on the wooden bench. He picked it up carefully and noticed that a small, barely discernible blue cross was embroidered on one corner. His heart raced. It was the same handkerchief he remembered seeing in the mysterious woman's hands. This couldn't be a coincidence. Back in his room, he tucked the handkerchief into the pocket of his worn denim shirt, as if it were a treasure. He spent the rest of the day twirling the piece of fabric between his fingers, feeling it was the only proof he wasn't crazy. But each answer seemed to raise even more questions. Why hadn't anyone else seen her? Why weren't there any records of her at the hospital? And most importantly, why would she leave that handkerchief behind, as if it were a sign? That night, as the hospital fell silent and only the distant sounds of televisions breaking the monotony, Jonathan awoke with the feeling he was being watched. He turned slowly and swore he saw a female silhouette standing in the doorway. His heart raced, but when he blinked, the figure vanished, leaving only darkness and the sound of his own breathing. "I'm going crazy," he murmured, but deep down he knew it wasn't a hallucination. It was something else, something unexplainable. The next day, the doctor overseeing his recovery discharged him partially, recommending rest at home. Jonathan didn't argue. He left the hospital with shaky steps, driving a pickup truck borrowed from a friend, the radio flickering between stations. The road seemed quieter than ever, and with each mile he traveled, the feeling of emptiness deepened. But the handkerchief in his pocket burned like fire, reminding him that this story wasn't over yet. Arriving at his farm, he found everything as he had left it: the fence down, the horses restless in the pasture, the ranch marked by loneliness. He sat on the porch with a pot of black coffee, gazing at the sunset-tinged horizon. Suddenly, the radio on the table began to hiss alone, until soft music emerged, accompanied by a female voice singing. Jonathan froze. It was the same voice he had heard in the hospital, whispering to him to have faith. Startled, he turned off the radio, but the sound continued to echo in his mind, as clear as if she were right beside him. He clutched the handkerchief tightly and realized he was involved in something beyond mere coincidence. It was as if he were being guided, step by step, to discover a truth greater than he could comprehend. That night, when he finally tried to sleep, a dream invaded his mind. The woman in white walking through a moonlit field, handkerchief in hand, looking back and calling out to him. Jonathan woke in a cold sweat, his heart racing. The feeling was clear. She not only existed, but wanted to be found. And now, the search for this mysterious woman wasn't just a wish. It was a mission that would change his life forever. The following days were filled with a restlessness Jonathan couldn't explain. Every time he looked at the handkerchief tucked away in the drawer next to his bed, he felt a hidden message. It was as if the piece of fabric wasn't just an object, but a calling. Determined not to let the mystery fade away, he began discreetly investigating, talking to neighbors, attending Sunday Mass, and asking if anyone had ever heard of a woman matching his description. The answers were always vague, but one detail began to recur. Everyone was talking about a hospital girl who appeared and disappeared without explanation, helping patients who were near death. This story circulated as a legend among the elders, and some even swore she wasn't flesh and blood, but an angel sent to bring comfort. Jonathan listened in silence, his fingers clenching the handkerchief in his pocket as if clutching forbidden evidence. But the more he listened, the more his mind filled with questions. What if it were true? What if God had answered his prayer that night in the ravine, sending this woman so he could have a second chance? Doubt gnawed at him, but at the same time, it fueled a faith he'd believed had been dead for years. On the farm, routine was slowly returning, but nothing felt the same. He rode the horses, mended fences, fed the cattle, but his mind was always elsewhere. One afternoon, as he drove his old blue pickup truck to the neighboring town, he passed the hospital. His heart pounded, and before he knew it, he was parked in front of the entrance. The hallways had the same smell of alcohol and ether, the same hiss of portable radios scattered throughout the rooms. But to Jonathan, everything seemed tainted with the memory of her Dot. He went up to the ward where he had been admitted. The room was occupied by another patient, but on the wall near the window was a small bluish mark, as if someone had touched something dyed there. He approached it, and to his amazement, realized it was identical to the color of the embroidery. On his handkerchief, a shiver ran down his spine. This couldn't be a coincidence. He left the hospital in silence, but with the feeling that he was getting closer and closer to discovering something that wouldn't fit with ordinary explanations. That night, at home, he turned on his tabletop radio, expecting to hear the local news, but it began to hiss. A soft voice pierced the airwaves, so low it almost sounded like a whisper. "Keep looking." Jonathan froze, his heart racing. He looked around the room, handkerchief clutched in his hands, but no one was there. He turned off the radio, only to hear the hiss persist for a few seconds, then fade away completely. The silence that followed was as heavy as a sentence. His dreams began to change too. Now, it wasn't just the image of her walking under the moon. In his dreams, she came closer, extending her hand and repeating the same phrase. "Faith is the way." Jonathan woke up sweating, his chest burning, and each time he felt he was being prepared for something greater. But prepared for what? That was the question he couldn't shake. He then determined to revisit the accident site. He got in his pickup truck and drove down the winding road, the tires kicking up dust on the broken asphalt. The sun was setting behind, the hills tinting the sky red and gold. When he reached the ravine, he stopped before the still visible marks of the accident. He stood in silence, listening only to the wind and the distant chirping of crickets. Suddenly, he felt the same chill he'd felt that night. He wasn't alone. He turned slowly, and for a moment, he swore he saw a female silhouette in the distance, near the fallen fence. He ran toward her, but as he approached, there was nothing but the field swaying in the wind. On the ground, however, he found a small metal crucifix, worn with age. He picked it up and held it to his chest. It was another piece of this puzzle that seemed to be revealing itself little by little. Back at the ranch, he spent hours staring at the crucifix and the handkerchief. 2 signs, 2 proofs. Something inside him screamed that these weren't just coincidences. As the radio softly played an old song, Jonathan made a decision. He wouldn't rest until he discovered the truth about this mysterious woman. But deep down, he feared that the truth would forever change not only his life, but also his faith. The next morning, he was awakened by an unusual noise. Someone was knocking on the ranch door. Jonathan rose slowly, his breath catching in his chest. When he opened the door, he found only the chilly night wind, and on the doorframe, a carefully folded sheet of paper. Shivering, he unfolded it. The message, written in delicate handwriting, simply said, "I was here." Jonathan stood transfixed by that short, enigmatic message. The paper trembled in his hands, and each letter seemed to pulse with its own energy, as if it had been written the very moment he opened the door. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, and carried the same softness he remembered in her voice. "I was here." Those words echoed in his mind all night, keeping him from sleeping. He wondered, why did she appear and disappear like this? And more importantly, what did she want from him? The next morning, his eyes heavy from lack of sleep, Jonathan got in his pickup truck and drove into town, determined to uncover any clues. About the woman, he passed the church, where the local priest, an elderly, calm-spoken man, greeted him attentively. Hearing the story, the priest wasn't surprised. Sometimes God sends messengers to remind us that it's not time to give up, he said, with a look that seemed to pierce one's soul. Maybe you're facing something that doesn't need to be explained, just experienced. But those words only deepened his unease. In the days that followed, Jonathan began to sense subtle changes around him. The nights at the ranch, once silent and heavy, became marked by small signs. The radio turning on by itself, the porch light suddenly flickering, a scent of lavender filling the air for no apparent reason. They were memories of her, impressions that made him believe the nurse hadn't left, but was there, invisible, guiding his steps. With each sign, he felt closer to something greater, as if he were walking along an invisible road. One afternoon, while searching the barn, he found an envelope hidden among the loose boards of the wall. Inside was an old black and white photograph showing a young woman with features very similar to the nurse's. On the back, the date, 1958. Shock ran through him. How could that woman be in the photo, taken decades earlier, when she looked the same age as she did now? It was impossible. But the impossible no longer seemed like a barrier to him. Determined to pursue this new thread, Jonathan took the photo to the city library. He rummaged through old newspapers and dusty archives until he found a news story that chilled his blood. In 1960, a young nurse named Catherine had died in a road accident just a few miles from the same hospital where he had been admitted. The physical description was identical. He read and reread the clipping, his heart pounding. Was he being cared for by a woman no longer of this world? That night, Jonathan returned to the ranch with the photo and newspaper clipping in hand. He placed them on the kitchen table, next to the scarf and the crucifix. The 4 pieces seemed to form a puzzle, both macabre and divine. He felt a chill run down his spine, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Catherine was somehow still present. The question that tormented him was, why? Sleep came heavily, but the dreams were even more intense. Catherine appeared clearly before him, her eyes shining like stars, and said, "You were saved for a reason. The time for hiding is over." Jonathan woke gasping, the damp handkerchief in his hand, as if it had been handed to him that instant. The real and the unreal no longer had clear boundaries. The next day, Jonathan drove to the hospital again, carrying the photograph. He showed it to an older nurse, who froze upon seeing the image. "My God, that's Catherine. I heard stories about her when I was younger. They said she appears to patients in critical moments, but don't say it out loud. Many people think it's crazy." Jonathan realized that what he was experiencing was not just a personal vision, but part of a mystery that spanned generations. Driving home at dusk, he turned on the pickup truck's radio. Amid the static, a woman's voice cut through again, clear as ever. "Trust, Jonathan. I'm with you." He braked sharply, his heart racing, looking out at the desert fields around him. There was no one there, only the sound of the wind rustling, the tall grass, but he knew he wasn't alone. And in that moment, he understood that his life would never be the same. What he didn't know yet was that the signs were just beginning, and the next one would be impossible to ignore. For it wouldn't come in dreams or whispers, but in something real, tangible, right before his eyes. The next day dawned with a strange energy in the air. Jonathan woke early, drank a strong coffee, and went out to tend the horses. The sun had barely risen, and fog still covered part of the field like a white blanket. As he was putting hay in the barn, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned immediately, but there was no one there, only the insistent sound of hooves hitting the ground. Still, he swore he could smell a familiar scent of lavender invading the air. His heart raced. Catherine was nearby. Determined not to run from his feelings, he spent the day observing every detail around him. At dusk, when the sky turned orange and the old kitchen radio began to crackle, it happened. A soft voice cut through the crackling and said with frightening clarity, "Open the door." Jonathan froze, his hands trembling. He walked to the porch and opened it slowly. Before him, resting on the doorframe, was the crucifix he had put away days ago. But most frighteningly, he didn't remember taking it out of his shirt pocket. Stunned, he picked up the object and clutched it to his chest. There was no doubt. Catherine was neither a memory nor a hallucination. She was there, communicating with him in some inexplicable way. That night, he could barely sleep. When he closed his eyes, he saw fragmented images. Catherine walking through a moonlit field, her scarf swinging in her hands, and behind her, an intense glow like a celestial light. With each vision, Jonathan felt he was being called to something greater. The next morning, Jonathan decided to seek answers in a different way. He drove into town and went straight to the church. He sat before the priest and told him everything, holding nothing back. The priest listened silently to the end. Then he placed his hand on the table and said, "Son, there are encounters that don't belong in this world. But if she's still with you, it's because there's something that needs to be fulfilled. Find out what that purpose is." The words resonated deeply, and Jonathan left with a mixture of fear and determination. When he arrived home, he found the living room door ajar. His heart raced, and his hand instinctively went to the empty holster on his belt. He entered slowly, each step echoing. On the hardwood floor, on the table was something new, a recent photograph, clearly taken inside his own ranch. In it, Jonathan was seen asleep in the porch chair, and behind him, standing clearly, was the figure of Catherine. The image was so real, his legs nearly gave out. It was impossible to ignore Dot, holding the photo in his hands. He sat down heavily, his breath shallow. There was no longer any way to convince himself that it was all a figment of his imagination. Catherine was indeed appearing in his life. But the photograph raised even more questions. Who took it? How could a woman who died in 1960 appear in a current photo? And above all, what did she want from him? These questions burned like hot iron in his mind. That night, Jonathan lit a candle and placed all the objects on the table: the handkerchief, the crucifix, the newspaper clipping, and now the photograph. He remained silent for long minutes until he felt the same gentle presence fill the room. The wind blew in through the open window and blew out the candle, leaving only the moon illuminating the room. In the darkness, her voice rang out clearly. "Don't be afraid. I'm with you." Frightened, but also filled with an inexplicable peace, Jonathan closed his eyes and murmured, "What do you want from me?" The silence was absolute, but in his mind, a word repeated like an echo: faith. It was as if Catherine were asking him to trust, even without answers. The next day, at dawn, Jonathan received an unexpected visit from his sister Sarah. She entered the room and, upon seeing the photo on the table, turned pale. This woman. I saw her when Mom was sick in the last days of her life. She was in the room, caring for her, and then she disappeared." His sister's words were like a knife cutting through the veil of doubt. It wasn't just him. Catherine appeared in moments of pain, bringing comfort and hope. Jonathan felt the weight of the revelation. Catherine wasn't just part of his story. She was linked to his family, to his destiny. And now, more than ever, he knew he couldn't back down. The next step would be to discover the mission this woman, or this angel, was trying to reveal. And something inside him told him the answer wouldn't come gently, but through an event that would change everything forever. His sister's revelation was like a bombshell inside Jonathan. For hours he sat on the porch, staring at the photograph, trying to piece together the mystery. The wind blew hard, making the ranch's timbers creak, and the old radio antenna swayed, making strange noises. As night fell, something happened that he would never forget. A flash of light appeared in the sky, illuminating the field as if it were day. Jonathan ran outside and saw an intense light hovering over the pasture, motionless, silent, almost supernatural. In his heart, he knew Catherine was there. Startled, he took the crucifix from his pocket and held it up with a trembling hand. "If it's you, show me what I must do," he shouted into the wind. The light flared brighter and then disappeared, leaving only the sound of the cattle rustling in the corral. Jonathan went back inside with his heart racing, unsure if he had witnessed a divine phenomenon or had completely lost his mind. But deep down, a certainty grew. Catherine was leading him on a mission he didn't yet understand. The next day, Sarah returned to the ranch carrying an old envelope she'd kept since. Her mother's death. "I never understood why I kept this, but I guess it makes sense now," she said, handing it to her brother. Inside was a yellowed letter, written decades earlier, signed by Catherine. The text spoke of hope, faith, and never abandoning those in need. Most disturbing was the date, 1959, a year before the news of her death. How had that letter ended up in their mother's hands? Jonathan spent the day rereading the letter, each word etching itself into his mind like a living message. Never be afraid to begin again, because God always sends signs to those who sincerely seek. That phrase seemed written especially for him. But the mystery deepened. Catherine wasn't just a recent apparition. She had been part of the family's life for much longer than they could have imagined. That night, Jonathan went to the barn. He lit a lamp and stared into the empty space where he had so often dreamed of starting over. The distant sound of footsteps made him turn quickly. For a moment, he saw a female figure standing beside the ancient wagon. His heart raced, but as he stepped closer, the figure disappeared, leaving only the intense scent of lavender. It was as if Catherine were testing his faith, appearing just long enough to keep him on track. The signals grew bolder and bolder. One morning, Jonathan woke to the kitchen landline ringing insistently. He answered, his voice trembling. "Hello?" On the other end, silence. And then, a soft voice he would recognize anywhere. "Don't give up, Jonathan. Your purpose is near." Before he could respond, the line went dead. He stood there, clutching the phone tightly, tears streaming down his face. From that moment on, the ranch ceased to be just a home. It became a place of anticipation, where the real and the supernatural intertwined night after night. Sarah, now convinced that something bigger was happening, began helping her brother record every sign. Photos, notes, objects that mysteriously appeared. The Miller Ranch became a sanctuary of mystery, where every detail carried a message. The greatest test was yet to come. One rainy late afternoon, Jonathan heard a loud knock on the door. He thought it was Sarah, but when he opened it, he found a strange man in a soaked black suit holding an envelope. His gaze was serious, almost cold. "You shouldn't mess with what you don't understand," he said, handing over the envelope and howling, turning away without explaining anything. Jonathan opened the letter with trembling hands. Inside, there was only one handwritten sentence. "The truth about Catherine can destroy or save you." The impact of those words fell upon him like an unbearable weight. Who had sent this? Who else knew about Catherine? And why warn her that the truth could destroy him? Suspense tightened his mind like a trap. He realized he was involved in something much bigger than a simple supernatural encounter. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat before the fireplace, watching the flames dance, while Catherine's photo, handkerchief, crucifix, and letter lay laid out on the table. The silence was absolute, but inside him, a battle raged, between fear and faith, between doubt and hope. He knew that whatever his next step was, it would change his life forever. And when midnight arrived, an unexpected sound shattered the silence. 3 loud knocks on the living room window. Jonathan rose slowly, his heart pounding. When he pulled back the curtain, he gasped. Outside, in the pouring rain, stood the silhouette of a woman, motionless, staring directly at him. It was Catherine. The shock of the sight nearly made Jonathan fall backward. Catherine was there, standing in the rain, her white dress soaked and clinging to her body, but her hair didn't seem wet, as if the water hadn't touched her. Her eyes shone in the darkness, fixed on him with an intensity indescribable. Jonathan slowly opened the window, his heart pounding, and whispered, "Catherine ... is that you?" The figure remained motionless for a few seconds, then slowly raised its hand, pointing toward the field behind the ranch. Courage and fear mingled within him. Jonathan grabbed his leather coat, pulled on his boots, and stepped out into the rain, each step echoing like thunder in his chest. When he reached the backyard, Catherine was no longer at the window. Now he saw her standing beside the fence, a few feet away, illuminated only by the lightning that streaked across the sky. He ran toward her, but as he approached, she vanished into thin air like smoke. On the ground, only a rusty key remained. Lying in the mud, panting, Jonathan grabbed the key and held it tightly. There was no doubt. Catherine wanted him to find something. But what? He returned inside, soaking wet, lit the fireplace, and twirled the key in his fingers. unable to sleep for the rest of the night. The sound of the rain mingled with the crackle of burning wood, and her presence still seemed to permeate every corner of the house. The next morning, he told Sarah everything. His sister's eyes widened when she saw the key and said, "That's not just any key. It looks like it's from some old trunk." The two spent the day scouring the ranch for something she could open. They searched the barn, the house, the basement. Nothing. But that night, Jonathan had a dream too clear to be a dream. Catherine walked up to the old oak tree at the back of the ranch and pointed to its roots. Without a second thought, the next day Jonathan grabbed a shovel and went to the tree. He dug for hours, sweat streaming down his face despite the morning chill, until the shovel hit something hard. With trembling hands, he removed the earth and found a dark wooden chest with rusted hardware. His heart raced when he realized that the key Catherine had left fit the lock perfectly. With Sarah at his side, he slowly turned the key. The click echoed loudly, as if releasing something hidden for decades. Upon opening it, he found old letters, yellowed photographs, and a leather-bound diary. Every page spoke of Catherine, but in the first person. The diary was hers. Here were her fears, her prayers, and above all, the promise that, even after death, she would continue to care for anyone who needed faith and comfort. Jonathan's hands trembled as he turned the pages. Every word seemed written for him, as if Catherine had known he would one day find the diary. In one passage, she mentioned a man scarred by the accident, who would be saved to fulfill a greater purpose. Jonathan swallowed hard. This couldn't be a coincidence. It had been written before he was even born. That night, as he read one of the passages aloud to Sarah, the radio suddenly crackled. Catherine's soft voice pierced the waves once more. "Now you know. The next step is to trust." Sarah clasped her hands to her mouth, startled, but her eyes shone with emotion. Jonathan clutched the diary to his chest, feeling the weight and responsibility it brought. But along with faith came fear. If Catherine communicated with him so clearly, what would come next? Were he prepared to face the truth to the end? The wind blew hard, making the windows tremble, as if the entire house were being shaken by an invisible force. And deep down, he knew the greatest secret had yet to be revealed. Catherine's diary seemed to come to life with each page Jonathan read. The handwritten letters had a strange power, as if they carried her very presence. "I will be where there is pain, or someone cries silently for help," read one passage. Jonathan closed the book with trembling hands. This wasn't just a memory. It was a promise that spanned time. But what most left him breathless was finding, near the end, a direct mention. "To the man who will survive the abyss, I give my mission." His stomach churned. The accident, the rescue, the apparition, everything pointed to him. That night, as he read more passages quietly, the fireplace crackled loudly and the wind whistled outside. Sarah, sitting nearby, watched her brother with teary eyes. "John, this isn't just about you. Maybe it's about everyone who will hear this story." He nodded silently, but the weight on his shoulders felt crushing. Then a dull thud from the barn made them freeze. A door slammed shut, though there wasn't enough wind for it. They ran to it, the lantern lighting their way, and found something impossible to ignore. The crucifix, now hanging on the wall, glowed as if emanating its own light. Jonathan approached, his breath ragged, and when he touched the object, a wave of heat coursed through him. He fell to his knees, his eyes welling with tears, and whispered, "Catherine, I'm listening. But what do you want from me?" The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like screaming. Then, deep in the barn, her shadow loomed for a brief moment, and her voice echoed not through his ears, but within his heart. "Take my message to the world." Jonathan burst into tears. sensing that this presence wasn't just spiritual, it was divine. The next day, driven by the need to act, Jonathan took the diary to the priest. The old man leafed through the pages reverently and said, "Do you understand what this means, son? Catherine is not just a memory. She is a living testament that heaven walks among us. But beware. The closer you get to the truth, the stronger the resistance of darkness will be." These words fell upon Jonathan like a dark omen. He knew that faith brought light, but it also attracted darkness. The following nights were marked by strange phenomena. The radio turned on and off by itself, lights flickered, and objects moved. Jonathan felt not only Catherine's presence, but also something opposite, a shadow haunting his house. Sarah began to have nightmares, dreaming of voices whispering to her to leave the ranch. But Jonathan knew he couldn't back down. The diary spoke of courage, of persisting even in the face of fear. One of those nights, while Sarah slept in the guest room, Jonathan was awakened by the deep sound of heavy footsteps on the porch. He grabbed his antique shotgun, flung open the door, and found only darkness. But on the floor was another note, written in Catherine's same, gentle handwriting. "Do not fear. I will be with you until the end." He took a deep breath, fighting back tears. Each sign made her more real, but also more unattainable. Yet something still haunted him. Why had Catherine chosen him? Why not another man, another family? The answer seemed hidden between the lines of the diary. Flipping through it again, he found a passage highlighted by a cross. The chosen one will recognize the call not by chance, but by pain. And it will be in the silence of the night that they will find their true mission. Jonathan closed his eyes, feeling the phrase burn within him. He had already been called. Now he had to accept it. The next morning, he decided he would no longer live in the shadow of doubt. He took his diary, handkerchief, and crucifix to the highest hill on the ranch, knelt and prayed as he hadn't done since childhood. The wind blew hard, and for an instant, he felt a hand rest on his shoulder. When he opened his eyes, there was no one there, just the horizon illuminated by the rising sun. But deep down he knew Catherine was their dot. As he descended the hill, he found Sarah, pale, clutching the landline phone. "John, you won't believe this. I got a call." A woman's voice said time was running out. And before hanging up, she repeated your name. Jonathan's blood ran cold. Catherine wasn't just sending signals. She was approaching a final revelation, something that could change everything he understood about life and death. Jonathan could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was a dream. The nights at the ranch were marked by Catherine's gentle presence, and each time she appeared, his heart raced in a way he hadn't felt since his youth. It wasn't just fear or reverence. It was a deeper, more intimate, almost forbidden feeling. He found himself observing the delicate features of her face, the sparkle in her eyes, the way her voice enveloped the room. It was impossible not to wish she were flesh and blood, someone with whom he could share the solitude of the porch, the simple breakfast, the small details of life. On a full moon night, Catherine appeared again, this time not far away, but sitting beside him on the porch. The wind blew the living room curtains, and for a moment, it seemed as if the whole world had stopped to make room for just that encounter. Jonathan was breathing quickly, afraid that any word would break the spell. "Why do I feel like I've known you my whole life?" he asked, his voice breaking. Catherine smiled slightly, tilting her head. "Because souls that seek each other are never lost. Neither time nor death can erase what was written." Those words pierced Jonathan like fire. He reached out slowly, and to his astonishment, he felt her touch warm, soft, real. A shock coursed through him. "Are you an angel or a woman?" he whispered, his eyes watering. Catherine didn't answer. She just leaned closer, so close that he could smell the scent of lavender mixed with the damp earth. "I am what you need me to be," she murmured, before vanishing into thin air, leaving. Only the warmth of her hand etched on his skin. The following days were tormented. Jonathan could no longer deny it. He was falling in love with something he couldn't understand. The desire to see her again was unbearable, and every sign made her more present. Sarah, worried, tried to warn him. "John, this could destroy you. Don't fall in love with something that might not be human." But he was already lost. Every night he waited on the porch, praying that Catherine would return, even if only for a few seconds, and she returned. In a silent dawn, Catherine appeared in the room, sat beside the bed, and stroked his hair. Jonathan opened his eyes slowly, and the tears flowed uncontrollably. "If you're just a dream, may I never wake up," he said, holding her hand tightly. Catherine looked at him tenderly, her eyes welling as if she, too, were fighting against something greater. "Our time is short, Jonathan, but it is not in vain." Her lips approached his, and for an instant the impossible happened. A soft, sweet kiss that burned brighter than fire and left him with the certainty that love could cross worlds. From that moment on, Jonathan had no doubts. It wasn't just faith. It wasn't just a miracle. He loved her, even if it was forbiddance, even if it wasn't logical. But fate still held its final revelation. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the ranch with an old newspaper in her hands. "John, you have to see this." It was a report about Catherine, confirming her death in the 1960s. But next to the news was a photograph of her family. Among the people was a young woman with features identical to those he loved so much, but dressed in modern clothes. Jonathan fell silent, his heart racing. It was like looking at Catherine, but it wasn't her. Sarah explained, "That's her granddaughter. She lives in another city, still works as a nurse. They say she inherited not only her looks, but also her vocation for caring." Jonathan felt his legs weaken. The woman he sought, the one whose presence consumed him, wasn't just an apparition. She was a living legacy. And maybe, just maybe, destiny was about to bring them face to face. That night, alone on the porch, Jonathan held the crucifix, the handkerchief, and the photograph. The wind carried the scent of lavender again, and Catherine's voice whispered. In his mind, now you know, love without fear. He closed his eyes, his chest burning with emotion. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning, and their next encounter would reveal whether the love that had spanned generations would finally find its place in reality. Jonathan couldn't sleep that night. The image of Catherine's granddaughter's photograph burned in his mind like an unquenchable flame. Every feature of her face, every detail, seemed a perfect reflection of the woman who had been accompanying him in dreams, signs, and apparitions. His heart, already torn between faith and mystery, now clung to the hope that there was, indeed, a real chance to love and be loved in return. Dawn arrived, bringing a decision. He would wait no longer. He got into his old blue pickup truck, the radio blaring old country songs, and headed toward the town where the young woman was said to live. The road seemed longer than ever, but each mile was driven by a mixture of anxiety and faith. As he drove, Jonathan remembered Catherine's soft kiss, her warm touch, the words she whispered. Our time is short, but not in vain. Now he understood. That promise wasn't just hers, but something that spanned generations. It was as if Catherine had paved the way for her granddaughter and Jonathan to meet. Destiny, more than ever, seemed written by the invisible hands of something greater. Arriving in the small town, he parked in front of a simple hospital with a weathered facade. He took a deep breath before entering, his handkerchief and crucifix tucked into his pocket like talismans. The hallway smelled of alcohol and ether, the same scent he remembered from his nights of pain. But now there was something different. The feeling that each step brought him closer to a definitive revelation. He discreetly asked for information at the reception desk, and when he mentioned the young woman's name, his heart nearly stopped when he heard, "Yes, she's on call today." It was then that he saw her. As he turned the corner, his eyes met hers. The young woman was a dead ringer for Catherine, but alive, vibrant, with the energy of someone who still had her whole life ahead of her. She wore a white uniform, her hair tied simply, but the same serenity in her gaze that had so often comforted him. Jonathan froze, unable to speak. The young woman frowned curiously and approached with a soft smile. "May I help you, sir?" Her voice, it was the same one that had accompanied him in his dreams. Jonathan felt tears well up. "I'm sorry, I just ... I thought I'd never see you." She smiled shyly, as if she didn't understand, but at the same time, she felt something inexplicable. "Have we met before?" The question hung in the air like an electric spark. Jonathan took a deep breath, removed the embroidered handkerchief and crucifix from his pocket, and handed them to her. The young woman's eyes widened, filling with tears within seconds. "My God, those belongings belong to my grandmother. How ... How did they get to you?" Silence filled the hallway. Jonathan wanted to explain everything, but he knew there were many things he couldn't say without sounding crazy. He simply took her hand and said firmly, "I think your grandmother introduced us, and somehow she knew we'd be here someday." Her eyes filled with tears, and in that instant, an invisible bond was sealed between them. It was as if Catherine had reached across time and death to unite two souls destined to meet in the days that followed. Jonathan and the young woman spent hours talking, sharing stories, discovering similarities, and building an intimacy that grew with the naturalness of something already written. Faith, mystery, and love intertwined in every word, in every look exchanged. Jonathan felt that, for the first time, the ranch could be a true home, marked not only by silence and memories, but by laughter, hope, and a new love blossoming. One golden afternoon, as they walked through the countryside, the young woman took his hand and said, "My grandmother always told me in her dreams that I would meet someone marked by pain, but also by faith. Now I know it was you." Jonathan stopped, emotion overflowing, and kissed her. It was an intense kiss, not of doubt or longing, but of promise. There, under the open sky and the gentle wind, they understood that Catherine had not left. She had fulfilled her mission to unite two hearts. The Miller Ranch, once shrouded in silence and mystery, was once again illuminated. Sarah smiled at the sight of her happy brother. The horses ran freely through the fields, and even the radio always seemed to play the right song. But on moonlit nights, Jonathan could still smell the scent of lavender in the air, and he knew Catherine watched them silently, proudly, because in the end, it wasn't a story about death or ghosts. It was a story about faith, hope, and love that spans generations. Catherine, somehow, guided Jonathan to what he'd always sought, not just answers, but a home and a heart where he could finally rest. And now I ask you who have followed this story thus far, if you were Jonathan, would you believe in miracles of fate? Write in the comments which city or country you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the next exciting and inspiring stories. The ranch, which once bore only the weight of loneliness, had now become a place of hope. Jonathan woke early, but no longer to face the silence. He woke to hear the sweet voice of the young nurse walking beside him, helping with the chores, laughing at the simple things, restoring his sense of belonging to something greater. On Sundays, together with Sarah, they attended the town church. And when Jonathan closed his eyes to pray, he no longer asked for miracles. He was grateful that he had already received them. The nights still held their mysteries, Every now and then, the wind would blow, bringing the scent of lavender, and the radio would softly play old songs, as if Catherine were still nearby, watching over them. Jonathan was no longer frightened. On the contrary, he smiled. He knew that Catherine was not just a memory or a shadow, but a bridge between worlds, crossing time so that his granddaughter and he could meet. It was love transformed into a legacy, alive, tangible, eternal. Life went on, and with it came new stories, new beginnings. Jonathan realized that the greatest miracle lay not in visions or signs, but in the courage to open his heart again. Catherine's granddaughter brought him more than companionship. She brought him the chance to rebuild his home, to feel human touch again, the warmth of a kiss, the certainty that it's never too late to love. And so, a cowboy who once stood between life and death understood the message Catherine had left in every detail. Faith guides, but love saves. The ranch now flourished not only with grain and horses, but with feelings. And each sunset on the hills was a silent witness to a love born not only of earthly encounters, but also of the invisible hand of fate. And for those of you who stayed until the end, tell me, do you believe that love can span generations and unite hearts that would never meet by chance? Leave your answer in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because here you'll always find stories that combine romance, faith, and miracle stories capable of touching your soul.